Good afternoon, everyone. This is a webinar for the recently released Monitor Existing Structures Bulletin. You can see on the agenda we have some items to discuss for you today, the first of which is the new Specification 108, which will go into effect in this coming January. That will help us to better understand the activities required by the contractor. Secondly, we'll discuss the requirements of the bulletin itself, including how to correctly place the information in the plans. Then we will look at a few examples which will further clarify the effort needed to comply with the bulletin. We also have Alan Hart here that he's going to go over staff hours and scope. That will again further clarify the efforts needed to comply with the bulletin. Lastly, we have available Larry Jones from the Structures Office, Juan Castellanos from the Geotechnical Office, Denise Broom from the CAD Office, Missy Hollis from the Estimates Office, and myself to answer any questions that you have. And we'll take as many questions as we can for the limited time we have this afternoon. So let's start with Specification 108. The opening paragraph of this specification says to the contractor that the department will pay to have structures monitored as a proactive measure to warding off claims for damage and nuisance. However, the contractor continues to be fully responsible for any damages caused by his activities, whether a structure is monitored or it's not monitored. There are three types of monitoring described in the specification: settlement monitoring, vibration monitoring, and groundwater monitoring. We will briefly cover each of these types of monitoring. First, let's discuss inspection and settlement monitoring. This is a proactive measure to ward off damage to structures and is associated with Pay Item 108-1. Settlement monitoring is associated with three types of construction activities. The first is miscellaneous structures, the second being structures other than miscellaneous structures, and then roadway compaction operations. So the first type, construction of miscellaneous structures, is related to activities necessary for the construction of miscellaneous foundations, such as signs, signals, and lighting, as described in the specification. This type of construction activity does not have prescribed limits, and I will explain what we mean by prescribed limits in a moment. But because there are no prescribed limits, any existing structure that needs to be monitored must be identified in the plans. The second type of construction are for structures other than miscellaneous structures. So these are your walls, bridges, and buildings, and again, as described in the specification. This type of construction does have prescribed limits listed in, as you can see on the screen here, item 2 through 6, which gives some prescribed limits. So, any structure that requires monitoring that is within these prescribed limits is automatic for the contractor. For instance, sheet pile operations, the contractor must determine what structures are to be monitored that fall within 200 feet of the sheet piling work or activities. So we will only identify in the plans those existing structures to be monitored that are outside these prescribed limits. This is what item 1, as shown in the plans, is referring to. The third element, roadway compaction, is related to activities necessary for earthwork and pavement construction, again as described in the specification. The element does have prescribed limits, and therefore any structure that requires monitoring that is within 75 feet is automatic for the contractor. And again, only when there is a structure that is outside the prescribed limits but requires monitoring should the structure be identified in the plans. The specification then describes the inspection part of inspection and settlement monitoring for all structures within prescribed limits, and for the structures that we identify in the plans. The contractor is required to document the condition of the structure before, during, and then after construction. TCEs or license agreements are not needed to access properties to perform the engineering investigations by the contractor. The authority has been granted by the Florida statutes 337.274. The second type of monitoring is vibration monitoring, which is a proactive measure to ward off nuisance claims and is associated with the Pay Item 108-2. So nuisance claims occur when activities being performed in a structure are interrupted or affected by vibration as described in the specification. These existing structures are sometimes referred to as sensitive business operations, which we will discuss further when presenting the bulletin. The most common activity for this type of monitoring are vibratory rollers used in pavement and earthwork compaction. This type of monitoring does not have prescribed limits, which again means that any structure that is to be monitored must be identified in the plans. The third type of monitoring is groundwater monitoring, which is the proactive measure to ward off damaging a structure and is associated with Pay Item 108-3. Groundwater monitoring is an uncommon activity. I understand that we have required groundwater monitoring only on a handful of projects over the last 5 years. This type of monitoring does not have prescribed limits, which again means that any structure that is to be monitored must be identified in the plans. The specification closes by indicating the correct pay items to be used. To recap, there's 3 types of monitoring. Settlement monitoring, which is the proactive measure to ward off damage, 108-1. Then the vibration monitoring, that is a proactive measure to ward off nuisance, 108-2. And the last being groundwater monitoring, that is also a proactive measure to ward off damage, 108-3. Moving on to the design bulletin. So this was a joint bulletin put out by several offices, as you can see here, and it was released on July 8, 2015. The bulletin provided a new chapter for the PPM outlining the requirements for the designer. It established the monitor existing structure pay item numbers, and then it included references of the new PPM Chapter 34 and the Soils and Foundation Handbook. So walking through the bulletin, you will see that it coincides with Specification 108, which we just went through. So the intent of this chapter is to provide instructions to the designer for the development of the list of existing structures that should be monitored during various construction activities. The list is most often based on engineering judgment and the information available at the time that we go out and take a look at the site during our reviews. The department may identify structures that require more in-depth investigation and analysis and also a need to develop mitigation strategies. The development of the list is a team effort between the designer and FDOT project manager and FDOT design staff. The chapter begins with a description of types of structures that should be considered for monitoring. Some examples of sensitive business operations, which I mentioned previously, they are provided, but they are not all-inclusive. A structure should be considered sensitive if there's the possibility that the business being conducted in the structure would be affected by vibration. We will touch more on this in a couple of slides. Just as with Specification 108, Chapter 34 addresses the same 3 types of monitoring: settlement monitoring, vibration monitoring, and groundwater monitoring. The first type, settlement monitoring, contains the same 3 elements as the specification: construction of miscellaneous structures, construction of structures other than miscellaneous structures, and roadway compaction. Settlement monitoring does not have prescribed limits in Specification 108. Therefore, if a structure is to be monitored, place that structure in the summary box in the plans. The designer is expected to perform a site review and assemble a list of recommended structures to be monitored. Our example of settlement monitoring for miscellaneous structures is highlighted in yellow on this slide. A historic masonry cemetery wall is in close proximity to the construction of a mast arm foundation. It was determined that inspection and settlement monitoring would be performed for this structure. Thus, the wall is listed in the summary table with an X placed in the appropriate column. A note is also included to let the contractor know what construction activity the monitoring is associated with. Recall that the settlement monitoring for structures other than miscellaneous structures contain prescribed limits. They were listed in that 2 through 6 in the specifications. That is why there are instructions for how to address existing structures that are within the limits as described in A, and also if the structure is outside the limits described in the letter B, as you see on your slide here. When there are structures to be monitored within the prescribed limits and none outside the limits, the summary will include a total of 1 under the pay item 108-1 and not list any structures. Notice in the note included below the summary table, this list does not contain existing structures to be monitored that are located within the distances specified in Article 108-2. Also would mention that if pay items 108-2 and 108-3 are not used, that these columns would be removed from the table when you put them in the plans. Our example of settlement monitoring for structures other than miscellaneous structures is highlighted in yellow. So a historic church has been identified for monitoring that is located just beyond the 200-foot prescribed limits for sheet piling installation. Thus, the church is listed in the summary table with an X placed in the appropriate column. A note is also included to let the contractor know what construction activities the monitoring is associated with. The third type of construction activity for inspection and settlement monitoring is the compaction operations. This type of activity contains prescribed limits of 75 feet in the specification. The contractor automatically must monitor structures that are within the 75 feet of all compaction operations. If there's a structure within the distance and none outside the limits, the summary will include a total of 1 under the 108-1 and not list any structures. This is similar to a couple slides ago where we just have the 1 and we do not list any other structures. So for our example of settlement monitoring for compaction operations, it's on the slide highlighted in yellow. A bed and breakfast is identified that is located just beyond the 75-foot prescribed limits for milling and resurfacing operations. Again, the bed and breakfast is listed in the summary table with an X placed in the appropriate column, and a note is also included to let the contractor know what construction activity the monitoring is associated with. The next type of monitoring, and the last one here, is vibration monitoring. Recall that vibration monitoring is a proactive measure to ward off nuisance claims. There are no prescribed limits for this type of monitoring. Structures that are conducting sensitive business operations are to be identified for the monitoring for vibrations. The most common activity that we're going to run into would be paving operations in an urban corridor, milling and resurfacing. Our example of vibration monitoring is highlighted in yellow. These structures conducting sensitive business operations were identified for monitoring. An antique shop, a bed and breakfast is included for the paving activities. And then we have an eye surgery clinic that's included for pile driving operations. So take notice that the bed and breakfast has been shown for both inspection and settlement monitoring and for vibration monitoring. These are two different monitoring activities, and it was determined that both are needed for this structure. One, again, looked to as a proactive measure against damage, and the other as a proactive measure against nuisance. So this is the last type of monitoring. As specified earlier, groundwater monitoring is uncommon if a structure is located within the cone of influence for dewatering operations. This type of monitoring may be considered. But again, I'll repeat again that it is not a common type of monitoring. For our example, we have one structure identified. So we have a museum that's included for anticipated dewatering activities. There may be times when the use of a restrictive note is appropriate. The use of notes for this type does require district approval. Requiring static mode during paving compaction should not be used as a mitigation strategy to avoid possible impacts to structures conducting sensitive site operations. The designer has done due diligence in identifying structures that should be monitored and has populated the summary table accordingly as shown. So now we have coordination between the designer and appropriate department staff, and then the department will make the final determination on what structures they will pay the contractor to monitor. This is the summary of monitor existing structures box shown here on the slide that would be placed in the summary of quantity sheets. Note that no matter how many structures are listed in the total quantity, this is a lump sum pay item and the total quantity is 1. The X only serves to identify what type of monitoring is required for the listed structure. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan Hart. He's going to go through the scope and staff hours.
All right. Hi, my name is Alan Hart. I'm going to go over the scope of services and staff hour estimation forms today. What we've got up on the screen is the roadway section, the 4.19 that we've had changes to. The text at the top is going to be the actual changes to the scope of services document, and then what you see below that is the staff hours estimation form. If you take a look at the staff hours estimation form, that's kind of a breakdown of what the task includes and a range of the hours that would be required to do that, and it's based on a lump sum. Just to clarify, what the roadway engineer will do in this situation is he is essentially looking to determine the structures that will be requiring monitoring during the construction phase. This is not the time to develop a mitigation strategy. This essentially is the time just to develop the structures and to determine which structures could be. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the structural staff hour estimations and the scope of services for the structural engineer. If you take a look at this, there's no changes to the scope of services, but we do have changes to the staff hour estimation form. Going back, I just want to reiterate that these hours that are seen here, the 4 to 16 hours for coordination, these are simply to develop the mitigation strategies. We've already determined in the scope of services that there are going to be existing structures that will require mitigation. So the hours listed here are for that. If there are any hours that will be used to actually determine the structures, those come from the 80 hours, the 4 to 80 hours that are listed in the 4.19. So the EOR can ask the geotechnical engineer or the structural engineer to help him identify existing structures, but these are not included in this section. That would be included in the 4 to 80 hour range that we showed in section 4.19. Once again, these hours are simply to determine the mitigation strategies for the existing structures that have been identified that will need mitigation. And also included here is the coordination with the EOR to do that work. Finally, we're going to look at section 35.19, which pertains to the geotechnical engineers. Once again, the scope of staff, scope of services language has changed. You take a look there at the top at the 35.19 monitoring of existing structures. We have modified that language in the scope of services, and we also have modified the language in the staff hour estimation form, and we have changed the range of hours a little bit there. So once again, if you take a look at this, similar to the structural engineer, these hours are going to be set aside to actually develop a mitigation plan for the existing structures that have already been determined that will need mitigation. So once again, that will already have been determined. If the engineer of record, if the EOR does decide that he wants to enlist the geotechnical engineer to help him with determining the actual structures that need to be monitored, once again, those hours are included in the 4.19 staff hour estimation form, the 4 to 80 hours. So once again, these hours need to be kept separate, and these are only hours that would be used to develop the mitigation plan. With that, I'm going to turn it over back over to Paul.
Yeah. So our first example today is it's going to be State Road 52. It's down in Pasco County. It is a urban milling and resurfacing project. All other improvements are minor, so the thing that we're concerned with is the milling and resurfacing, the pavement operation. So the vibration is what we need to take a look for and see what impacts we might have. So if we go over to the two again. So here we are, we got our Google Maps up. Here's the project, State Road 52, beginning at US 19. So if we zoom in here a little bit, there we go. Okay, and turn on our satellite map here. You can see it's highly urbanized with buildings that are fairly close to the roadway. Like I said, we're interested in milling and resurfacing, so for the damage portion of it, 108-1, these types of structures that we see in here are not something we're concerned with damage for milling and resurfacing the vibration. If you get down on the ground, you see that these are fairly modern buildings, nothing historical, nothing that looks like it would be harmed by milling and surfacing operations within 75 feet. But what we are concerned with is nuisance claims. And so you can see that if this is the edge of the pavement right in here, 75 feet, 100 feet, you're out in here, so about this distance out in here, and you can see that means you're going to touch a lot of structures on both sides of the corridor. You're going to be right at the edge or a little bit into the structures on both sides of the corridor when you look about 75, 100 feet out. So what we'd want to do is look for structures that have sensitive operations that may be impacted by the vibration. So I have gone down this corridor previously. I got down with the Google man and went down the corridor, and I could find no businesses either identified here. I mean, you can see some of these identified, and also down on the ground looking at marquees and plaques of the buildings and the names of the businesses that are being conducted in there. I could not find any sensitive sites in this area. So let's go ahead and assume that, say, this building right here, or this one's a better one, Hungry Howie's right here. Let's assume that there are some businesses in here that are conducting some sensitive operations. So let's go down to the ground and we'll take a look at the structure. We'll get facing the right way. All right, so in this little strip mall right here, let's say that in here that we have a business that is a dentist, and so he's taking some film strips and he's doing some drilling. He's doing some sensitive operations that could be impacted by some vibration that's going on by milling and resurfacing along this roadway. So we would list this structure. Say it's this one right in here. We will list this structure to be monitored. If we have one right next door to it that happens to be an optometrist that's doing eye exams or putting eye drops in or doing some exams of that sort and may be impacted by the same types of activities, we would want to monitor that one also. But what I want to point out here is if we have both of these here, what we don't need to call out these individually. We monitor buildings or structures and not businesses. So if this whole building is one number, which I can't tell by looking at the marquee, but if the building is all one number, we just monitor the building and not the individual business in there. And even if these were two different structures sitting next to each other, same distance back off the roadway, we could monitor one of these, and the information that would be picked up for that business you would be able to apply it to the business next door. Same type structure, same soil, same distance off the roadway. So that's what you call your mitigation strategy, to monitor these things. Again, if these were two sensitive site operations going on in this building structure right here. So that's just an example of what you would look at. You would put the table in the plans. You would show 108-2, which is the settlement monitoring. You would list just the building one time under that, have the note down below, and you would be done with the job. So this is a preliminary look at the corridor, and this is something that you can use during the scoping phase or get an idea of what you need to look at once you're out there. And let's see if I can get back to the aerial view, back to the map. So that's something you can use during the scoping stage. Once your table is completed, you got 60% plans or just prior to 60% plans, you would go out there, you would drive the corridor, and then you would put your eyes on the corridor and look for those sensitive sites and confirm there's nothing that you didn't see or nothing that didn't open or closed from the time that you were looking here on the Google Maps in a preliminary. So that's your on-site observation. You would go out there and take a look. So when the table's completed and it goes into the plans what we're responsible for, we're not responsible for any businesses that open after we've completed our assessment. Businesses do open and businesses do close, but we will complete our list based on what we see at the time that we go out there and do our field visit. So that's kind of what is expected for an urban resurfacing job. Okay, so for example 2, we're going to use Bing. This is State Road 710. This is down in Palm Beach County. This has a mix of improvements on it. First and foremost is milling and resurfacing of Dr. Martin Luther King Boulevard here between Old Dixie Highway just beyond Australian Avenue. In conjunction with this, we're doing some improvements here at the intersection of Australian Avenue, and then also to the north here on Australian Avenue is reconstruction, and along with that reconstruction is some sheet piling that needs to be put in place on both sides of the roadway on Australian. So first, looking down Martin Luther King Boulevard, we need to take a look at what our impacts for the milling and resurfacing should be. Here we don't have any other activities. I say that, but we'll go back and look at this intersection. But for the road itself, the activity that we need to look at is vibration from the pavement activity. So let's go ahead and take a look at aerial and see what we have down the corridor. Here you can see that this is a residential area. You see the houses that are all lined up here. Most on the north side here. I don't really see anything on the south side. It looks like everything is been taken out. But here on the north side, we do have quite a few residences along the north side. So here, I'll say that normally we do not monitor residential. But in this particular instance, the district recognizes that this is an area, a sensitive area, that they've had numerous complaints from previous construction activities. So they want to be proactive and monitor how much vibration these residential units are absorbing. So you can see that these residences are about the same distance off the roadway, same soil, same type structures and such. But so what the district decided to do is come in and monitor a sampling of structures along the corridor to understand what vibration they are subjecting these structures to. So in this row right here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 residences along here. They picked one. They picked one somewhere in the middle here, and they said, okay, we're going to monitor that structure. The information that we get from the monitoring here for vibration will tell us how we're impacting this whole row of structures. And that was their mitigation plan. And so they carried that forth. In here, they just monitored one structure in here, just to get one in here, I believe. So just to get an example or get some readings that they could apply to all of those structures. They also had in here a church that was right here, and so they wanted to monitor that church. And in fact, in this site, in this whole area, there's about 3 churches that are within close proximity to this construction, and the district elected to monitor all 3 of those for various reasons. This one was due to milling and resurfacing of the roadway. They decided to monitor this structure. In here where they're reconstructing the intersection, they did have new mast arms, and so the foundation of those mast arms, because of the reconstruction in here, they were getting pretty close to this structure right here, so they decided to also include this as 108-1 for possible damage. So they wanted to make sure that when they excavate for this foundation and put in the mast arms, that they would not cause any settlement to this structure right here. So the contractor will this is listed in the table, and the contractor will go out there and do inspection, both pre and post, and then also monitor it during the construction. So as I said before, there's sheet piling that is being put in along both sides of the right-of-way going to the north to reconstruct a portion of this roadway. And so with sheet piling, again, there's prescribed limits of 200 feet. So if we include the 108-1, the contractor will be responsible for anything within 200 feet. And I'm going to say it's out in here somewhere, about 200 feet. So all of these structures in here, across here, are automatically going to have to be monitored by the contractor. He'll have to come up with his own strategy and a mitigation plan for monitoring based on his construction activities as means and methods. So what we're looking for with this sheet piling is we're looking for nuisance, because that does not have a prescribed limit, the 108-2. So if we have anything in here that we think would need to be monitored because of the vibration of putting in that sheet pile for nuisance, we would want to list those. Again, here's another one of those churches. It's within that 200 feet of the sheet piling activity. So for nuisance, we will also monitor that site. So this is inside the prescribed limits. I'm going to speak specifically to the church. It's inside the prescribed limits, so it will be monitored for both the settlement monitoring, the inspection and settlement monitoring, and then also for vibration monitoring. It'll be monitored for both. Again, they took a sampling, even for the sheet piling, for the vibration and the nuisance. They took some sampling from these structures out here to get an idea of how much vibration these structures are being subjected to. And there were some outside the prescribed limits. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find them right now, but just outside the prescribed limits there was a third church, and they did list that church also, even though it was outside the prescribed limits. They decided to go ahead and monitor that one also. So let me show you the, let me show you what their table ended up looking like. Again, so they had some churches on here. You see that well, there's actually a fourth church, so there was 3 churches, and that fourth one, there was one that was just outside the prescribed limits. But you can see that they are looking at some residential units. They're going to go ahead and take a look at a sampling of those to see what impacts they're causing as a mitigation strategy. And then they place their X's, and then there's always a total of 1 down at the bottom, no matter how many is placed in here. So over here, notice that 108-1, the inspection and settlement monitoring, there is nothing that they identified outside the prescribed limits from 108-1. So even with the mast arms that they were putting in, the sheet piling they were putting in, everything associated with those activities, the structures they identified were inside the prescribed limits, so they do not list any structures individually. So now within these prescribed limits, the contractor, the pay item is here, and the contractor is responsible to go out, locate those structures that need settlement, inspection and settlement monitoring, and come up with his mitigation plans to do that. And that is example number 2. Okay, so our third example, our final example here, is I-75 reconstruction widening. It's down in Charlotte County. What we're really interested in here is the activities that are going on inside the corridor that would require looking outside of the right-of-way. Of course, with limited access right-of-way, we got a pretty good wide right-of-way in there, but if we have some activities that are up close to the right-of-way, some earthwork compaction, or around where the interchange, and this does have some interchange improvements right here, right in the center there, where we're going to have some pile driving to widen or place new structures. So we're going to have to look and see what all of those activities, what kind of impacts we will have down the corridor. So let's go ahead and look at our Google Earth, our Google Maps. Okay, so the project starts up in here, and then goes down to the south. But here's the interchange where we're doing some work here, some widening and widening the structure, replacement of the structure. I'm not sure which this job was doing, but we do have some piles that are going in here. So we'd be looking for this pile driving activity. We're looking about 200 feet is the prescribed limit. So looking in a circle around here, it's 250 feet. It's probably right about here somewhere. So let's turn on our satellite view. So if we're doing some pile driving here, you're going to have to look 250 feet. We might be getting close to these right here. Don't really see anything up in the other corners here. Again, I think we're pretty far outside here. Actually, looking at this thing, I think everything's going to be outside the 250 feet, but you would have to get something measurable here and see what the distance is. But I think everything's outside the 250 feet, so you would not have, you would not be concerned about having impacts due to the pile driving operation. Going down the corridor, if you were to have some sheet piling or some work that's out alongside the right-of-way, you see you got a bunch of structures here. So if you had some earthwork compaction that's going on fairly close down in here, you'd have to look and see if you're within that 75 or 100 feet. But again, these are residences and residential, and we don't really, we do not monitor for residential units or residential structures for nuisance, and so that would be a district decision if they wanted to take a sampling to see what kind of vibration these are receiving. But in general, we do not monitor residential for nuisance, for vibration, for earthwork compaction and milling and resurfacing. But going down the corridor, you don't really see anything else too close. Now, if we ended up having to have some sheet pile that was up against the right-of-way or in close proximity in this area or something, if we had some sheet pile, again, that would be 200 feet, and we'd have to look and see, how we're affecting these structures over here if it's within the 250 feet. If we were doing something in this area and this happens, or say we're putting some sheet piling in just right here, and this building was 200 feet, was right at the face of the building, again, you might want to consider monitoring that. You would have to use a judgment call there to list it or not list it to be monitored. You would just have to decide and go through that decision-making process. Again, right here you got a fire station. That's not really something we'd be concerned about nuisance. They can run their activities with or without the vibration, so we're not worried about nuisance. But if you're doing some sheet piling in here, you'd want to see if that's within 200 feet of that and just include the pay item number. Again, you do have prescribed limits of 200 feet, so if it's within that 200 feet for sheet piling, you would just include the pay item number, and you'd be done. An interesting thing on this job was there was a tower, a cellular tower that was I think just outside the 200 feet to pile driving operations for one of these bridge structures, and I'm not overly familiar with this project, but again, there was some kind of a cellular tower that was close to some pile driving operations, and it was just outside, and there was a question about should we monitor or not. And it was decided no, we should not be monitoring those cell tappers. They have substantial footing that would not be harmed. If we're outside our prescribed limits, it wouldn't be harmed from pile driving operations. And so that is the end of our third example.